everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in my own right, not somebody else's right like last time. This is a subject I've spoken about frequently before, and was somewhat uncomfortable to talk about because I don't want to leave academic life with the only reputation being that I speak about research on animals and have this reputation for representing animal research. I mean, it looks a little bit that way, and it reflects personal experience. In 1987, I was targeted by all major animal rights groups in the UK as part of an attempt to utilize, to make use of new legislation that had just been introduced in Britain, which contains a provision for the minister to overrule the normal process of assessing who should hold a license and what they should be allowed to do if there is public outcry about a particular area of research. It's not an unreasonable provision. So these groups got together, I knew nothing about this in advance, and decided that they would try to generate outcry by representing, of course I would say grossly misrepresenting the work of one particular person, and they chose me. And I know people who did it and spent a lot of time talking about it subsequently, and at a kind of intellectual level it's difficult to criticize them for having selected me. I fitted the bill precisely. First of all, I was working at Oxford, and I doubt whether they would have picked someone working in an unknown provincial university. I was working on mammals, not on invertebrates. In fact, I was working on cats, so there's all the issue of domestic animals and pets. I was working on development, postnatal development, that means kittens. And working on visual development, and some of the experiments involve closing the eyes of kittens. So you can see how it's so easily misrepresented as, scientists, blind, defenseless pets. So, you can see rationally, logically why they chose me. It didn't feel right at the time, I must say, because I was hit with this massive, organized, initially entirely legal, if unreasonable, campaign of pamphleting and demonstrations and colleges being lobbied to conduct debates and all those sorts of things, questions in the House of Commons, and stuff that was presented to them through the media and so on. But then it very rapidly transformed into active terrorist activism. But terrorism is hard. It's a word that's maybe over-deployed these days, but if a group or individuals set out deliberately to cause terror, then it sounds like terrorism, and that's certainly what they did in my case. With bombs being sent to my home, very potent bombs sent to my home, and police protection for my children all the time, literally all the time for many months on end. Police stationed outside my home, school with my kids evacuated on 2 occasions because of bomb scares, and it was a pretty awful period of time, for 13 or 14 years. And that preceded some of the developments I'm going to talk about in this presentation. But you can see why I tend to get asked to talk about the issue, even though it's often something I'd rather forget. And I should say I've had really no significant problem apart from a few strange emails, but don't we all get strange emails in the last 10 years or more. But in fact, I don't hold a license for animal research and haven't done research on animals for more than 10 years. Okay, let's just run through the kind of ethics 101 of animal experimentation. And first of all, animals have been used for a very long time to advance knowledge about how the body works. I suppose the first obvious accounts were from Egyptian embalming techniques 3,000 years ago or more, in which there are observations on the organ structure of animals in comparison with humans. 2nd century AD, Galen, a very important figure in the history of medicine, was a physician working in Rome and then in Bergamo on the Aegean coast of Turkey, who conducted dissection of animals, not humans, of animals, and interpreted the observations in terms of human function and disease. And his observations underpinned scientific knowledge and medical treatment for more than 1,000 years, because the early church effectively introduced a ban on dissection, even of animals, certainly of humans. Aristotle dissected, and from the 13th century on to the 19th century, a series of observations were made on animals, very important observations. People like Prof. Bernard, working in France in the beginning of the 19th century, one of the most distinguished physiologists of all time, the discoverer of mechanisms of homeostasis in the body and so on. These accounts, you read them in the history books and so on, in their own literature, are wonderful achievements of science until you suddenly think, just a minute, there were no anesthetics at the time. So everything that was done on a living animal was done without anesthetic, which is quite alarming. Anesthetics were introduced, I mean, as a consequence, some of that work was done in Britain in the 17th century, 18th century. But pretty much explicit decision was made in Britain anyway in the 18th century that it was unreasonable and unacceptable to do experiments, to carry out procedures on anesthetized animals, even though, of course, surgery on human beings was carried out without anesthetic. But animal research, the use of animals for teaching and so on was pretty much outlawed in Britain from the beginning of the 18th century until the latter half of the 19th century. Then anesthetics, chloroform, initially, and other anesthetics were introduced. And around the 1870s, 1880s, animal research was reintroduced to Britain, and that became the trigger for the foundation of some of the great medical schools in Britain. There was a huge amount of public protest at the time, in the 1860s, 1870s. And historically, it has an interesting sort of social background because the movement against research on animals was taken up by the British middle classes who had lived through the battle of anti-slavery and social reform, social welfare in Britain. And it was simply adopted as another legitimate cause for social concern. And it wasn't just experimental animals, it was also farm animals, pets, human mistreatment of animals in all forms that was a target of attack and criticism. But it focused particularly on research. As a consequence, Britain in 1876 introduced the first legislation in the world, and remained the only legislation in the world for 50 years, protecting laboratory animals, requiring the licensing of researchers, the classification of all techniques that were used and procedures that were going to be used, the licensing of establishments, the introduction of random inspection, inspectorate who could turn up anywhere at any time and ask to see everything, and regulations for the control of the husbandry, care and housing of animals and so on. This was all done at the end of the 19th century. Naturally, that legislation still, in principle, the principles of that legislation underpin all law around the world. The 20th century, of course, saw a huge expansion in the use of animals and the increasing adoption of animal procedures as part of the requirements for the development of medications. The preclinical stages of drug development, discovering causes of disease, identifying targets that might be a focus for the development of a new drug, and the testing of the safety of potential new drugs before moving into human clinical trials. And that's accounted for. Industrial use has accounted for a large part of the expansion of the numbers of animals that are used in research. Britain's also been ahead of the world in keeping records of numbers used. I mean, it's impossible in the States to find accurate records of animals used. And the federal law doesn't even classify rodents as experimental animals of any concern. And of course, most research is done on rodents. 85% or something in the UK of research is done on rodents. So it's hard to get an idea of numbers, but in the UK, there's something like 3 million animals a year used in research, and that number has been creeping up in the last few years. That figure, the 3 million figure, is sort of iconic and it's large and it's used a lot in campaigning. In fact, you have to think about what that really means in terms of individual investment in animal use. What it translates to is about 1.5 animals, and most of those are mice, per person in the UK per lifetime. So each person is morally responsible for the death of 1.5 mice. As it were, their part in the use of animals in research. In those terms, the numbers don't look quite so. Okay, how are animals used? Let's just refresh our memory. They're used not only for medical research specifically aimed at finding the cause of disease and curing it, but to explore normal processes, completely detached from medical issues. And that sort of research wins Nobel Prizes too. I mean, it's in no way disreputable to use animals simply to advance knowledge. And interestingly, the UK law, the 1876 Act, recognised that. It set up as the valid reason for using animals either the understanding of disease, the development of treatments, or the advance of knowledge. And I think that's admirable to recognise the advance of knowledge is a good, is a moral benefit which can be weighed against the obvious cost of animal suffering and death. It's also used to, of course, to understand the basis of normal and of pathological processes, increasing the genetic mechanisms, molecular mechanisms. It's used, and this is more dubious, to provide certain models of disease, which might be fine in the case of, let's say, certain kinds of cancer, or genetically inherited disorders where the gene is shared between humans and animals. But it gets much more dubious when attempts are made to create, through manipulation of animals, conditions that in some respect mimic human pathological conditions but never occur in that animal species. For instance, animal models of psychiatric disorder, particularly schizophrenia. They exist, they're used by drug companies in attempt to develop new treatments, but pretty dubious to argue that these are entirely valid. And then they're used very routinely and in substantial numbers to test the levels of toxicity of substances before they're used in human beings. And here the justification seems very straightforward. What really matters, of course, in the development of a new drug is the stage at which that drug is tried on people. To have a wonderful drug that can cure a mouse of a condition is great. That's not the idea. The idea is to work on humans. But if there were not a preliminary stage of testing both the efficacy and the risks associated with substances in animals, the only possibility would be to move straight into humans and make them the first subjects of exposure. So essentially, whatever is ethically dubious about using animals for that technique will become even more ethically dubious if it was used in humans without any prior attempt to assess the risk to those people. That's what it's about. Okay, so what's the ethical problem? Animals are used to advance knowledge, to understand disease, to try and develop treatments. That sounds perfect. But of course, there's an essential tension between the ethical, the moral requirement not to cause harm, and the moral imperative of trying to increase pleasure and happiness in this sort of utilitarian equation. And animal research involves recognizing some kind of balance between those two. So the arguments in favor of animal research, and most biological researchers, whether they use animals or not, and most clinicians, most do not use animals in their research, very openly accept that the contribution has been huge and that is still a continuing requirement for animal work. Well, the basis of that belief can only be a utilitarian one, that there are costs, of course. No one could claim that it's good to kill animals, or in some cases cause suffering to animals, but there must be an associated benefit which outweighs the cost. The problem with that, of course, is that the argument only works if research on animals is actually effective in doing what it says that it intends to do, that is to understand mechanisms to unravel the basis of disease and to help with the development of new treatments. And there's also a really important dilemma contained in the utilitarian argument in this case, because the costs involved in animal research, that is the fact that animals are born, kept, housed in captivity, and some people would claim that that's not good for them, that they, in some cases, certainly suffer during experimental procedures, and finally that they are killed deliberately at the end of an experiment. That's a requirement in most law. Those sound like pretty significant costs. Those costs are certain. When an experiment's done, those costs happen. The benefits are potential. Yes, you might advance knowledge, but sometimes the experiment doesn't work. So nothing comes out of it, the animals have died. The drug you're testing turns out not to be effective, or is too toxic to transfer into humans. So the costs have been there, been no benefits at all. And that's not an uncommon occurrence in animal research. There's a real problem here. The costs are certain, the benefits are not. And simple utilitarian theory, as it were, doesn't tell you how to deal with that. So the arguments against animal research are of two types. First, there is a very different one, which I think can't be deployed in favour of animal research, and it's an absolutist argument, a deontological argument, that it wouldn't matter how much benefit came from the study of animals. It could cure every disease tomorrow. It just wouldn't be right, because animals have rights, or we have absolute responsibilities not to cause any harm, unnecessary harm to animals. Therefore, it just can't be done. And there is a significant fraction of the animal rights movement that holds that position, where there is essentially no discussion. And actually, I think it's a much more respectable argument than the utilitarian one, because there is also a utilitarian argument that animal research doesn't work. It doesn't deliver the benefits, and with the costs often being very exaggerated. So you've heard the sort of headline statements by animal rights organisations. Every product developed on animals has been turned out to be dangerous to humans. Not surprising, animals are different from humans. We can't use them as models. Animal disease models are ridiculously simplistic. There are all of these arguments. And in any case, why are they scientists using animals? We've got alternatives to overuse of animals. It's just not necessary. So it's dangerous, it's inaccurate, it's old-fashioned, and it's completely unnecessary because we've got good alternatives. Those are the sort of arguments deployed for a utilitarian case against animal research. Well, those two positions have in the past become very polarised. I think one of the take-home messages that I want to make from this talk is that really we should have reached the point at which we can stop simply shouting at each other from sloganized positions and recognize there is middle ground. And it's very important to maintain a genuine dialogue, because the refusal to do that just forces people into ever more extreme positions, and extremism, at least on one side of this argument, generates highly undesirable behavior. So the opponents to animal research, sometimes certainly just deploy exaggerated, unsubstantiated arguments, and deny any benefits at all. On the other hand, the supporters of animal research are often guilty of overemphasizing the benefits, talking down too much the cost to the animals and the potential suffering to animals, and entirely ignoring the broad sort of philosophical moral arguments. So no one's perfect in this debate. One problem is that on both sides of the argument, selective quotation of evidence is a real enemy to proper discourse. And I'll just give you one example. Darwin's views on animal experimentation are often cited by both sides of the argument. And let me show you an example of that. Here is a quotation from Darwin on animal experimentation. I agree it's justifiable for real investigations on physiology. Correct. Darwin was a supporter. Here's another quote. Subject which makes me sick with horror. I'm not saying another word about it, I won't sleep tonight. And it's not just that these are statements made on different occasions by Darwin, they were made in a letter, in a single letter, and that's the full flow of the argument. You kind of get the feel of where it was going. Okay, if it's good science, it's rigorously done, it's for an important cause, I can accept it. If it's just frivolous and horrific, I don't would know about it. So the selective citation of evidence is a real problem on both sides. Okay, let me summarise the story in Britain, because I think it's very illuminating and it might not be known to all of you, because it carries a lot of lessons and messages which I'll discuss. I think it's generally recognised that Britain has been a kind of hotbed for animal rights activity, and has had to deal at various stages with real challenges to science. The chair that I held at Oxford, which was also held by Charles Sherrington, was established in the 1870s, late 1870s, as part of this introduction of physiology and animal research into Britain. It was opposed in the Senate, in the congregation of the university, that is the assembly of all the academics of the university, and was passed by the narrowest of majorities. And that was opposition within the university to the establishment of the chair of physiology and medical school. So it hasn't been easy. It isn't just in the last few years there have been problems. There have been problems many times, particularly at the end of the 19th century, with the foundation, the establishment of some powerful, very well-funded anti-vivisection organisations. The National Anti-Vivisection Society, the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, were all formed around this turbulent period, and they're very well endowed. Their turnover of funding is very high, and they still exist, and are very radical in their position. So let me tell you the story briefly. So first of all, in the 1880s, particularly, there was a lot of public concern following the introduction of the 1876 Act. And there were difficulties at various times in the first half of the 20th century, but it took a new turn in 1982, and it was the Australian ethicist, philosopher, working in Oxford actually, who published Animal Liberation, which is at the same year that Ronnie Lee, who was an assistant clerk in a solicitor's office in London, lawyer's office in London, formed this organisation called the Band of Mercy. The Band of Mercy initially was an anti-hunting group. Hunting in Britain doesn't mean firing automatic weapons at defenceless deer. It means sitting on a horse with a brass trumpet and chasing foxes with dogs. So it was an anti-hunt group. And as I said, that was formed the same year that Peter Singer published Animal Liberation, a very important book, which essentially is the Bible of animal rights. It argued there was no way of morally or he would say legally of distinguishing between the rights of living creatures. So there were no rational grounds for deciding that a rabbit had less right to enjoy a free life and not to be harmed than a human being had. So animals and humans were sort of equal, and therefore animals should be free. Now, this was taken up, of course, this became a kind of rallying cry, the Bible almost, for the animal rights movement. The Band of Mercy was renamed as the Animal Liberation Front, as a direct consequence of Singer's book. And he refocused its activity on research, because Singer was particularly critical of research. The academic community, which now became the target of a lot of the campaigning and a lot of the direct action, liberating animals, particularly destroying laboratory facilities and damaging records and all those sorts of things, was totally prepared. The universal response was just to be quiet, to increase the security, keep your head down, say absolutely nothing. Universities denied having animal research on their premises. Quite amazing, really, or refused to comment. So there was no real response. The media coverage, consequently, was increasingly hostile to the research community, because no one would ever say anything to journalists. So journalists could be fed with stuff from the opposition at every level of organisation of the animal rights movement, from the most reasonable conservative welfare groups right through to more really extreme animal rights groups. Plenty of copy from journalists, plenty of accusations, plenty of sort of leaked documents, and and movies shot in labs and so on, and there would never be any response from the scientists. So the stories were always very anti-science, stories of torture and harm and ghoulish behaviour and so on. This was through the 1970s and 80s. And then the intensity of the campaigning grew through the 80s and 90s. In 1997, you might remember there was an election. Tony Blair came to power after a long period of Tory government. And in the rethinking of the strategy, the policies of the Labour Party, it was decided to put much more emphasis on animal welfare. I must say, to be cynical, that was at least partly influenced by major donations that were given to the Labour Party from welfare groups. Shortly after one of those donations, £1 million donation, they produced a pamphlet, a pre-manifesto pamphlet called Labour, Britain, New Life for Animals, in which they made this commitment: Labour will support a Royal Commission to review the effectiveness and justification of animal experiments. When the scientific community saw that, they were just appalled at the lack of knowledge of Labour politicians in making that suggestion, because this followed only a few years after the introduction of completely new legislation in Britain, based on something like 3 or 4 years of debate and deliberation with the research community, with the opposition groups, with the clinical community, and so on. So the thought that a Royal Commission, that is another major review, and very costly review, could possibly be justified so soon after the introduction of new legislation was just thought to be nonsensical. And that must have gone through to the Labour Party because it wasn't included in the manifesto for the election. So it was not a commitment of Labour when they came to power. So in a way, this is the worst of all worlds, because they appeared to have made a promise. They withdrew it at the manifesto stage. They denied that they'd ever made the promise when they came to power, so they didn't try and enact it. And the opposition, therefore, were hugely encouraged by this. Expectation was raised enormously, only for that expectation to be dashed. And it really, I think, angered the extremists even more. They saw the possibility of progress just pulled away from them at the last moment. And I think that's what drove the real problems that we had from about 2000 onwards, shortly before 2000 onwards. And there was a rise of clever, it's undeniable, it was intelligent, very extreme activity in which the tactics changed. So one of the changes was that diversity of targets that were chosen increased, and the methods for attacking them changed. So interestingly, the emphasis moved away. This was towards the end of my period of problems from 1987 through to about 2000, 2002, something like that. Instead, they focused on industry and on animal supply. So the attacks on animal transport, for instance, the lobbying of transport companies, of the railways, of the ferries, of airlines, seeing them as a soft target and knowing that if they could stop transport of animals, that would seriously interfere with research, particularly primate research. And that has been very effective. It's led to a huge, amazing increase in the cost of primates for research in the UK. They targeted animal producers and animal breeders, recognising that they were a kind of soft end of the whole structure, the environment, if you like, of animal research. Many of them rather small, not very well defended, not rich, not able to put up the security and protection that big pharmaceutical companies could, or even in some cases universities could. So in the course of a year, half of all animal breeders in Britain were put out of business. They were put out of business by not just pressure and threats, by arson. Arson became increasingly the preferred tool, burning the company's vehicles, burning down outhouses, and so on. And it became, in some occasions, burning the houses of the owners of farms, and most of them just gave up very easily. In many cases, breeding guinea pigs or breeding rabbits or something was only a sideline for farmers and not something that they would, die in a ditch to defend, so they gave it up very easily. But it was, in terms of achievement, a real success for the opposition. They then moved on, and as you must certainly know, Huntington Life Sciences, which was a really major multinational toxicology clinical testing company, which uses animals to test potential drugs or chemical ingredients for foods or fertilizers or whatever, as required by law, under contract with companies, major operations in Europe, their headquarters in the UK. They became the prime target. And initially it was just, using the word advisedly, just burning the vehicles and, and parading outside the building. But then the tactics became more extreme and more varied. So this is the managing director, the CEO, Brian Cass, who was beaten up and left unconscious outside his house with 3 guys with baseball bats one night. And then they decided to focus their attacks on the support structure around Huntington Life Sciences, the insurance company, the insurance needs, their bankers. And one after another, the banks withdrew support, refused to take the account of the company. It was left with no banking facilities. The shareholders and traders in shares were all attacked. And it very nearly went out of business. I mean, one of the biggest toxicology testing companies in the world. The government finally, the government had been very hands-off until about 2002. They finally stepped in and allowed the Bank of England to become the banker for this company, absolutely unprecedented, offered insurance, property insurance, directly to the company just to keep it afloat. Well, having discovered that secondary tactics can be very effective, that was applied much more widely, along with arson, such as an article from 2005 about fire bombs against companies that were thought to be linked to Huntington Life Sciences, suppliers, banks, and so on. I mean, in Oxford, one of the college boat houses was burned down at a cost of about £500,000, and no obvious connection. I mean, the university was building a biomedical facility, which I'll talk about in a second, but a college boat has nothing to do with it. It was just that anything that had Oxford's name attached to it became a legitimate target. This technique of secondary targeting, recognizing that bankers, insurance companies, shareholders, whatever, were less likely to, in principle, to want to defend what a company or a university or whatever was doing, was very clever, and it really worked. So switching to private investors, storming into shareholders' meetings with placards that directly threatened individuals who own shares in companies. Pretty terrifying tactics. And hard to see that a law was being broken. That was one of the dilemmas at the time. Finally, and this was actually a really pivotal step in this saga. A campaign had been running for some 3 or 4 years against a guinea pig breeder in Staffordshire, a farmer who bred guinea pigs on the side. But for some reason, he decided really to hold out against this group, not just to roll over and give him so many more and had that. So they fought the battle, he had these vehicles and burns and all this kind of stuff. But the step that I think really shocked the country was the digging up of the body, newly buried body of a relative, an aunt, I think, of his wife. And the body was stolen, and letters were sent saying, we've got the body. Your aunt will return her if you give up breeding guinea pigs. And this was, cause to them in the UK. Well, things changed, and I'll show how they changed, but I'll do it by talking about the lessons that were gradually learned through this process. Lessons that were effective in the end, as you'll see, but they were learned with a lot of mistakes along the way. The first was the question of trust, and this is a much more generic issue around the question of the relationship between science and technology and society, which has been learned painfully in the UK as a result of a number of episodes, not least mad cow disease, which triggered this public hostility to science, lack of respect, trust for what scientists said. I mean, entirely misplaced in that case, but still, it was a real real crisis of confidence in science. So there's been a great emphasis on what it is that determines who the public trusts. Well, polls, opinion polls, wherever you think about them, something like this, and Maury has been running, on behalf of various organisations, and particularly the British government, running polls which ask essentially the same question over a long period of time now, 10 years or more. Just asking, would you tell me if you generally trusted some group to tell you the truth or not? So here are the percentage of the public who say that they trust these different groups of people. You've probably seen these kinds of studies. This is the latest version, 2011 version. So doctors and teachers are right at the top. Politicians and journalists always at the bottom. And interestingly, 2011 anyway, scientists do very well. Very close to the top, something on center. And as you'll see in a second, that level of trust has increased very considerably over the last 10 years or so. So trust tables, these sorts of trust tables are taken as an underpinning for a lot of government policy, who to suggest should be leading the discussion of particular issues, for instance. We've got, and I will refer to trust tables a bit, but don't take them too seriously. Let me give you a good example. Some of you might know this person. He's amongst the 10 most influential people in Britain at the moment. This is Mark Walport, who until the end of this month is director of the Wellcome Trust, which is the biggest independent medical funding agency in the world, bigger than Howard Hughes. He's going to become the government chief scientific advisor from the 1st of April. Okay, so when he is the government chief scientific advisor, should the public trust him? Well, let's see what the trust tables say. Well, first of all, he's a professor. It turns out the professors have 74% trust. That's good, because he's also a scientist of considerable reputation. He's an immunologist. Brings him down a little bit just to be a scientist. So that's not bad. Unfortunately, he will be a civil servant. Civil servants are down 47%. Or worse than that, he'll be a government scientist, which is 37%. But doesn't matter because he's a doctor. Doctors are 88%. So you have to be a little cautious when you're considering individuals about how you read these tables. What is it that determines your trust in other people? You listen to what they say. Of course, you use feedback. You will confirm or disconfirm what they've said, and that will influence what you say. But some of these judgments are just kind of gut judgments rather than particular judgments of what an individual has said and how reliable it is. I mean, why, for instance, are doctors and teachers right at the top, and journalists and politicians, so often at the bottom? Why should those have low trust and these have high trust? And in particular, why should journalists have this incredibly low rating when television newsreaders, who are after all journalists, have very high ratings? I think the conclusion, is obvious, and that is that visibility increases trust. The sorts of people that the public say they trust are those who are most seen, and in some cases most personally interacted with doctors and teachers, priests, for instance. And television newsreaders are in the face, they're chosen because they're attractive, of course, and they're there by the fireside every night, and you come to trust them because you see their facial expressions, their body movement, and so on, as opposed to unnamed journalists writing in newspapers, or distant politicians that you never actually meet. So I think familiarity with the person, judging them from their body language, which is something we do in everyday life all the time, is very important to determine trust. Okay, so these are two of the lessons I've learned. The third concerns the accountability of researchers themselves. And this was, as I said, in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, researchers generally just kept their heads down. You never saw any statement from researchers about the issue. And when my problems began in 1987, I asked my colleagues, senior people, my head of department, I asked the major organization that supported medical researchers using animals, the Research Defense Society, what to do, and everybody said, just forget about it, keep your head down, and it'll go away. Well, I didn't do that, because I thought, okay, so it goes away, but you're left with the stigma and the reputation forever if you don't respond. So I responded to absolutely everything, but that was not the normal course. Well, there has been increasing recognition of the importance importance of scientists themselves engaging with the public over issues. And it's come partly through two interesting and influential reports in Britain, which have ramifications everywhere in the developed world. The first was in 1985, a committee chaired by Sir Walter Bodmer, a very eminent statistician and cancer researcher. He was the director of cancer research in the UK. He chaired a group that produced a report called Public Understanding of Science. And the driver for that was some social research which showed that the general public's knowledge of the facts of science, do antibiotics kill viruses? Does the earth go around the sun? That's kind of pretty basic things. The level of knowledge was abysmally poor. So there was great concern expressed by distinguished organisations like the Royal Society about the fact that the general public didn't know that antibiotics don't kill viruses, and the world would be a better place if they did. So they commissioned this report to try and find out how to improve public knowledge of science. This report was produced, and just a couple of little segments to give you a feel for it. More than ever, people need some understanding of science. You know, there's the great unwashed public out there. They need to know some science. We'll give it to them. And of course, the people who should be doing the giving are scientists themselves. Scientists must learn to communicate and consider it part of their duty to communicate with the public. And this led to what's in the UK called Public Understanding of Science movement, and the so-called deficit model. The idea that the reason why the public might have low trust in science, be suspicious and wary about science and technology, is because they don't know enough about it. And if you can just fill them with knowledge, they're bound to become more trusting. That's the hypothesis. There are lots and lots of counterexamples, so the more you tell people, the more they say, just a minute, I didn't know that. I definitely don't want to have this stem cell stuff or whatever it is, this GM food. And thank you for telling me about it. But that was the general idea, the so-called deficit model. The other important report was from the House of Lords Science and Technology Select Committee in 2000, 40 years after the Bodmer report, when some of the activities that had been stimulated by the Bodmer report, and there were a lot of activities, all kinds of science clubs and events in pubs and festivals of science, National Science Week, science book prizes, prizes for academics, for engaging in science, all these things happened. But this was a reflection on what had been achieved by that 40 years later. And the conclusion was, the deficit model is wrong. You can't genuinely engage with the public just by feeding them information. You have to recognize their entitlement to comment, to interact, to argue, particularly on ethical issues. So the public are impressed by science, yes, but they're suspicious of its motives. And they talked about a crisis of confidence. I think it was a bit of an exaggeration, but you see the essence of the argument. Communication is often too top-down, and there are questions of trust and accountability in science which can be addressed only by engaging with the public rather than just didactically telling the public what's right. Okay, so then in that case, if engagement's needed, who should do it? Well, what I've, in this picture, I've done is a sort of list, I think, in order of influence, the sorts of organisations and individuals that do provide the public with information about science. Top of the list of media, but still most people say that they get their information about science from the newspapers, at least in Europe they do. Not yet exceeded by the internet in importance. Then the government, of course, which does its level best to provide information about science and technology. Industry, with a vested interest in industry putting a positive spin, and public personalities. Prince Charles tells us a great deal about science, not always to be believed. Single issue lobbying groups, and of course museum science centres. The scientific community in general is rather low on the list for their influence on the public. Well, interestingly, if you look at the level of public trust, it's inversely correlated with the frequency of exposure. So although the public say they get most of their information from the media, they have at least trust in the media and politicians, of course. It's very strange. And the high trust in scientists should be a good reason to give scientists more responsibility for communication. Well, how would that be done? Well, during the animal issue, one lesson that was rapidly learned was that the media had really played a crucial role in effectively promoting the case against science and influencing public opinion. Because the public get most of their information from newspapers. The newspapers were full of stuff planted, as it were, by people opposed to animal research. It's not surprising that the public were biased in their views. And the crucial step there was the kind of breakthrough to the point where scientists were actually willing to talk to the media about the issue. And it's a very interesting concept because this transition came with the early 2000s, change of attitude, at just the time when the violence, extremism was escalating very rapidly. So it took a lot of courage for people to say, yes, I'll take part in that, even though, unlike me, they hadn't been targeted. I mean, the reason why I started was because I didn't have any choice. I'd been chosen as a target. But I mean, I enormously respect the large numbers of scientists who made the decision positively to get involved in the debate, to make themselves available, to let cameras into their labs. And now, you know, there are just these little vignettes, really. More than 150 scientists through an organisation called the Science Media Centre in the UK have pledged themselves to making themselves available to the media at any time, allowing cameras in their labs to talk completely freely about their research and about animal research in general. So there's always a scientist to speak on the issue these days. Major funding agencies, when I was with the Medical Research Council, I was very, very pleased to promote this, to allow allow cameras into MRC labs, including primate labs for the first time ever. Universities as well, many of them, not all yet, many of them have a completely open approach to communication on the issue. And just one little incident, in 2006, World Lab Animal Day, international activity against animal research, simultaneously over 100 leading organisations, academies, societies, medical organisations, clinical organisations, published statements on their websites, publicly promoted documents backing the use of animals. So it's become a much more sophisticated and equal media contest. I'll just show you the example of how this works. This is a clip from a BBC 2-hour documentary on animal research by Adam Wishart. This girl was a graduate student, I think she's Harvard now, was a graduate student in Oxford. Oxford was building a biomedical facility. It is now built, but that had become the principal target for animal rights activity in the UK. Just a terrific level of protest. The company that had been engaged to build it withdrew because their staff were all being threatened, their vehicles were being burnt and so on. I mean, it was under wraps, just surrounded by scaffolding and protected security for 2 years before work began again on the building. And the building workers worked with ski masks on to avoid identification by extremists. And they were housed in secret accommodation outside. It's just amazing military level campaign. This girl, in the height of that, working in the pharmacology department, 50 meters from the new building, graduate student, agreed to contribute to this TV program. Right, let's hope this works. Oh, it's not working for sound. That's a very pity. Yeah, it's plugged in. Is my sound? Right.
Which is temperature controlled.
So do it again. Oh, yeah, I can try that. It's going to come through here.
And you can see here from what I've done when I'm torturing the rats. None of us are animal tortured in the way that any of us would want to hurt the rats. I mean, if I was hurting a rat, I wouldn't be happy at all.
Start again, I'm sorry.
And you can see here from what I've done when I'm torturing the rats. None of us are animal torturers in the way that any of us would want to hurt the rats. I mean, if I was hurting a rat, I wouldn't be happy at all. So now we're just bringing him into the surgery room. And we're going to put it in place him just on this blanket, which is temperature controlled. So So the next stage will be the surgery, which will involve cutting open the skull and showing the cranium of the brain, and then we will insert the electrode.
Although it seems that the animal is being treated kindly and it's suffering no pain, never far away is the thought that he's about to have his head opened up and an electrode inserted into his brain. So why would anyone do this?
We're trying to analyse single cells in the brain. These are the cells that degenerate in Parkinson's disease. And so it is important for us to understand those cells at a basic, fundamental level.
Are you not scared of talking?
No, I think it's important that there's a balanced view of the public, because right now scientists have kept quite quiet about what we do, as if we're afraid or we have something to hide. But we don't have anything to hide. It's just we're quite happy with what we do. We keep quiet because we work hard. And so I think it's important now for us to stand up for our rights, now that things are getting a bit out of hand in Oxford and we're being treated like criminals. And I think it's important that awareness is made, because I'm proud of what I do and I'm not afraid to stand up for medical research.
I mean, that's pretty brave. Like I said, a television program with an audience of 3 million or something like that on BBC, primetime television. It's inconceivable that would have happened 3 or 4 years even earlier. And that sort of thing is very common now with cameras in labs. And the reaction has been almost universally very positive, not an outcry from the public level of understanding. And the reaction of the press has been almost universally positive. To be able to find someone to talk to about any issue when they're fed with evidence from the opposition is bound to produce more balanced representation. So the presentation of the issues in the press has just improved out of all recognition in the last few years. And you just don't see enormously hostile, sensationalist articles anymore. Even though it makes great copy, it's always a great story, of course. Authoritarian, white-coated, crazy academics torturing animals in secret. I mean, it just doesn't happen. And as a prime example, when Cambridge University set out to construct, and got the money to construct a major centre for neuroscience research, which would have been devoted to a large extent to work on primates, and particularly neurodegenerative disease. It would have been a major contribution in that area. It was stopped, the university eventually pulled out, and at least partly because of intense opposition from animal rights groups and all kinds of threats to the building, to the people working in it, to the flow of traffic past it and so on. They cancelled the project. This was the story that the Daily Mail, not exactly the kind of most intellectual newspaper in Britain, ran on the day that Cambridge made its announcement. Now, I think that 3 years before they would have said, triumph for the supporters of the rights of tortured animals. What they actually ran was this story. A story on an Alzheimer's sufferer and the consequence for that person and his family of the interruption of research. So it was a pro-research story. And I think that can largely be attributed to the work done by the scientific community to improve communication. Here, typical 2006 BBC
blind mice, but
news
now
broadcast.
British scientists have successfully restored the sight of some by transplanting light-collecting cells into their eyes.
These mice were born blind. Now, incredibly, they can see. For the first time, scientists have successfully transplanted retinal cells, partially restoring vision in a matter of weeks.
We were told, 20-some years ago, there was no cure, there would never be a cure, don't hold your hopes up.
Well, I think it does definitely represent a major breakthrough. We've shown that cell transplantation is technically feasible in the retina, but it must be stated that it is a long way in the future until we'll actually be treating patients.
That's typically now how progress of research is presented. Direct reference to the animals visible in the cameras, explicit descriptions of what's being done to them. And again, 5 years before that, all of that would have been finessed. You could read stories about medical advances, and the animals wouldn't be mentioned. A quite deliberate decision by newspaper editors not to mention them, because it interfered with the parallel stories about ghoulish treatment of animals in labs running in the same newspaper at the same time. Just ridiculous to read a story criticising science because of the use of animals, and the same day read a medical story in the same newspaper about some new drug development or new breakthrough or whatever. Now it's much more consistent and coherent. So, finally, public involvement, the public themselves. If you could change public opinion, then the ultimate step, which was discovered, was to galvanise the ordinary public without a vested interest, not the scientists, not the anti-sexualist groups, whatever, to express publicly their views. So, the public is certainly capable of forming views, that's very clear. I'll give you a couple of examples of the sophistication, really, of public utilitarian analysis. So here was an early, in this story, relatively early poll conducted by the New Scientist magazine, asking people various questions about their attitude to research. So they said, okay, imagine research on childhood leukemia, emotive subject, it's being done on mice, not on monkeys. Would you support it if there was no pain involved to the animals? 83% of people, even in 1999, accepted that. But if it involved pain, it fell to 63%. So that's a utilitarian judgment. Too much cost. And equally, another 2000 now, Mori poll, another group asked, for any research, as long as there are no alternatives to the use of animals, would you accept it? Only 32% of people agreed at that stage that they would accept it. Even if there were no alternatives. But if it's for medical research, just in addition to that, for medical research with no unnecessary suffering, 84% agreed. So again, quite an interesting computation being done by people in their heads about what they think is acceptable. Okay, so what's the consequence? Look, this shows, first of all, trust in scientists here over this critical 10-year period, rising progressively from about 60% to about 71%. Trust, interestingly, exactly anti-correlated to trust in priests and trust in politicians and journalists, always hovering around the lowest possible level. This is I won't go into detail, but this is a text of a poll that Mori's run now over a 14-year period, asking people the same questions. These four crucial questions. I can accept animal experimentation as long as for medical purposes. I can accept it as long as there's no unnecessary suffering. Animal experimentation should only be conducted for life-threatening diseases. Some people say that. And I agree with it for all kinds of medical research where there's no alternative. And you can see the percentages now, this is 2000, whenever it was, 11, attached to those. If you group together all of those who say yes to one of those, at least one of those questions, you get what are called conditional acceptors, people who will accept under some conditions. And the numbers are really quite remarkable, up to 90% of the UK population. So there's a red line at the top here. These are conditional acceptors, people who say yes to at least one of those questions. And it started about 80%. It's down a little bit actually in the last sample, which is a little bit worrying, but it's been up around 90%. And the unconditional acceptors, those who just say, I accept medical research using animals, has steadily increased, and those who object under any circumstances has fallen. So significant shifts in public opinion. That 90% figure is really quite remarkable. I mean, pollsters will tell you to get 90% uniformity of view on any issue is almost unheard of. So to get on a really controversial issue like animal research is just remarkable. But this is the event that certainly had the biggest impact on me since it happened in Oxford. The biggest achievement of direct public involvement in the debate. It was the establishment of this movement called Protest, which was spent in States, and it was founded by a 16-year-old school pupil from Swindon, near Oxford, who happened to be visiting Oxford to buy something in a bookstore on the day of one of the big protests against the new animal facility. And he's now a medical student in Oxford. He saw this gaggle of people all screaming and protesting. He went into a local bookstore, bought a big piece of white card and a felt tip pen, and wrote on it, I support animal research. And went out to the street on his own, held it up in front of this group, which is very either crazy or brave thing to do, depending on the musician. But anyway, he then led to the foundation of this protest group. This was the first protest marches in Oxford, more than 1,000 people marching through Oxford on the same day as one of the organised protests against the lab, carrying these signs saying, I wouldn't be alive without element tests supporting the lab. One of the most interesting, and we can have another debate on that, of the signs that I saw at this meeting was a large sign, a group of people around it, vegetarians for animal research. It sounds kind of ridiculous, but just think about it. It just shows that it isn't a single moral question. It's quite possible to hold those two distinct positions. So the next effect was that public opinion really changed during that period of time. This is a poll in 2005, just with some of the sort of headline statements from that poll. But finally, the law was important, and I think that the decision of the government to strengthen law was driven partly by the concern about industry, Huntington life sciences and pharmaceutical industry, but also by the increasing confidence given by public involvement and the willingness of scientists to talk. Feeling this was an issue that they could finally afford, politicians could afford to get public on support. And one of the ways that they did it was by strengthening existing laws to stop, for instance, the use of emails for malicious attacks and threats, to keep protesters away from people's homes. And even before this strengthened law was introduced, I benefited from that because the police became more aware that they could use legislation to stop people protesting more than once outside my home. So one of the principal local ringleaders who'd been organising protests every week, virtually, outside my home, was arrested and successfully prosecuted. Under old legislation, and the new legislation is much stronger. You don't have that in the States, from my understanding. And I think it's hard to argue that this is a draconian thing to do. And as a consequence, the ringleaders, the 50 individuals, and that's what the police estimated to be the real ringleaders of this extremism, were all behind bars within a year, and all with pretty long sentences. So the group that did the disinterment, the group that led the attack against me actually were also involved, were all in prison. Some of them are now coming out, but under heavy surveillance. So that had a really significant impact. For instance, figures from the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry show that the number of so-called home visits, that means people coming and trying to smash down your front door, or big protests outside your house, or burning your car, really has fallen very, very dramatically. It's now virtually zero. Patience. Another lesson that really learned was that scientists could make as strong a statement as they like, and it's great that they were involved, but they had vested interest. It's their job, they earn their living from doing this. The people who really had a voice, powerful, was the people who might potentially benefit or have benefited from the research. So the involvement of patient groups was crucial, and I'll show you just one example. This guy, Mike Robbins, who's a good friend, has had deep brain stimulation electrodes implanted by Titlu Aziz, who's a surgeon, was at Imperial College, is now at Oxford. Some of you might have seen this movie before. Be prepared for a shock. Okay, so this is Mike Robbins. He's an accountant, just an ordinary, normal guy. As you'll see, Mike is a nice, normal guy.
The probe that is placed into the brain, I understand, comes level with the top of the nose and the ear. And it is connected to a battery in my chest, in my underneath the skin of my chest here. And this is controlled. I can control the amount of the voltage going in. I can control the length of time that the pulse is. And I can identify the number of times per second that it goes in. And I'll turn myself off now. Because my concentration now is up to 90% on my tremor and trying to control it. And I'm thinking that we're Parkinson's all the time. I'm not terribly, I'm not concentrating on my conversation with you at all. It's quite
you could imagine the impact of that on public. And certainly the techniques for deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's in the subthalamic nucleus were developed entirely through research on monkeys, which are pretty extreme, pretty hard to take, involving inducing Parkinson's in monkeys with a toxin damages the part of the brain which degenerates in human Parkinson's to create Parkinson's disease in the monkey. A very valid animal model. And then test stimulation in different parts of the thalamus to try to find regions which, when stimulated, could reduce the tremor or other symptoms of Parkinson's. But the justification for that is that it works. 50,000 people around the world have now been implanted deep brain stimulation. Peter Singer, I had a debate with Peter Singer and Steve Wise is the surgeon who developed it, who did the monkey work. And Singer said, it seems to me as though that's worthwhile. So, he was capable of making a utilitarian judgment in that particular case, even though the downside of the equation is pretty serious. The final point I want to make is, though, this is good. I think it's a real success story in Britain. We can never be complacent. Every new generation of young kids coming through, is in fresh minds being exposed to constantly to propaganda of the opposition. But I think if we're going to continue the line that we have to do one more thing, and that is to accept that the debate has to be nuanced. We can no longer work from these extreme positions in which everything the opposition says is nonsense, and everything we say is perfection. We have to recognise there's grounds for discussion and debate, and the recognition of the importance of criticism. So we need to tackle questions. And these are just some, I won't comment on these, just read them for yourself. Animal models. Many people will be very critical about how seriously we assess that is. Is there really more scope for alternatives? Is it worth debate? Do we give enough money for the alternatives? Is it central in the thinking of everyone researching on animals that it would just be better if there was an alternative to what they did? Is the regulation that we've introduced, which everybody accepts as just a crucial part of the law, is it now in itself a serious impediment to progress? Is it immoral? Is the level of regulation itself unethical because it impedes progress which could be beneficial? That's a debate worth having. How effective are we at evaluating evidence rather than criticism of this issue? Partly because of the eagerness of the drug companies to get into human trials, therefore too readily accepting flimsy evidence of efficacy of new treatments from the preclinical animal state. It's a real issue to address. And finally, this is the big one, particularly in Europe now, really how justified is the use of primates? It's recognised when there's a genetically very similar to us, they have big brains, they have complex cognition. How justified are we in using techniques on primates that undoubtedly cause suffering to them? And my position is that it can be completely justified, but we do need to open that up, real deliberation about it. Thank you.